من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد انتجبه لولايته واختصه برسالته وأكرمه بالنبوة وأشهد أن عليا ولي الله وأمينه في أرضه وهجته على عباده اللهم صل وسلم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله أوصيكم عباد الله وإياي بتقوى الله. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I want to take the opportunity to remind myself the importance of adhering to the principles of taqwa before advising you to adhere to the disciplines of taqwa. Taqwa, the idea, the element of which has been reverberated throughout the Holy Quran from the beginning until the very end. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu taqullaha haqqa tuqatih. O you who believe, fear Allah, be conscious of His existence the way He deserves to be feared. وَلَا تَمُوتُنَّ إِلَّا وَأَنْتُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ. And do not depart from this world except that you have wholeheartedly, in its absolute totality, submitted to Him and His message. In a different verse, for example, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ. O you who believe, fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَكُونُوا مَعَ الصَّادِقِينَ. And be amongst those who are from the truthful ones, those who are the embodiment of truth, those who represent the truth. Today is the 10th of Ramadan, which coincides with the death anniversary of the Holy Lady Khadija salamullahi alayha. When it comes to one of her fadila mentioned by the Prophet of Islam, he says that Khadija, she is siddiqatu hadhihi al-ummah. She is considered to be a siddiqa, the embodiment of truth. Wherever she goes, the truth is with her of this ummah. She is considered to be the greatest wife of Rasulullah. She was considered to be very loyal from the beginning until the very end. She was not only loyal, but she was determined to spread and be part of the movement of Rasulullah. She was the mother of Fatima al-Zahra salamullahi alayha. And of course, she was the first Muslim woman who joined the movement of Rasulullah as well. So all of these are the different fada'il of the Holy Lady Khadija salamullahi alayha. She stood by the Prophet of Islam during his best times and of course during the worst times as well. And she literally gave up everything she had to be part of his message. In fact, this is a hadith from the Prophet of Islam. When one of the wives criticized Khadija, he responded in the state of anger, and he would say that Khadija, there is no woman like Khadija. She stood by me when no one else would stand alongside me. She gave me everything she had. No money was as profitable as the money of Khadija. From her money, the debts were paid off. The orphans were looked after, and the poor and the destitute of Mecca were looked after as well. When we examine the life of Khadija salamullahi alayha, one of the greatest legacies that she leaves behind is how she used to care for the orphans of her time. And our financial responsibilities in the light of the legacy of Khadija salamullahi alayha is first and foremost supporting and looking after the orphans of our time. The idea of being empathetic and showing empathy towards the orphans. When you refer to the Quran, very interestingly, there are a number of verses which highlight the rights given to the orphans. And there are many, many different rights given to a particular orphan, or specifically orphans. And when Allah approaches this idea of orphans in the community, He uses very emotional language, somehow trying to captivate and grab our hearts, and which allows us to feel empathy towards the orphans themselves. And it motivates us to create empathy towards them. Observe the verse. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَلْيَخْشَ الَّذِينَ لَوْ تَرَكُوا مِنْ خَلْفِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّةً ضَعَافًا خَافُوا عَلَيْهِمْ. As in, for example, right now in this day and age, how should I treat an orphan? Not just in my community, but across the world. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, treat them as if you were about to leave your own children as orphans. As in, the ayah of the Quran explains, He says, let the people fear. Fear in which sense? If they were to leave behind their children as orphans, how would they want their children to be treated? This very emotional language is being used here. Allah is making us feel empathetic towards the orphans. These individuals, they know they're about to depart from the world. They will leave behind their children. Let them fear for the safety and for the good for their children. Treat them with goodness, treat them with kindness, treat them justly in such a way that if we were to pass on, we too would leave behind orphans as well. And how would we want to leave behind our orphans? In the time of Jahiliyyah, even today, certain remnants of Jahiliyyah exist within our societies. The rights of the orphans are exploited. Now this verse in particular, it speaks about the ahkam of earth. It speaks about the laws of inheritance. That when a person is about to depart from this world, a part of his inheritance should be given to their young children. And it's our responsibilities to make sure that the wealth does go towards the orphan. And it is not taken away from them. Sometimes we think to ourselves, well, the child is young. The child is what? A toddler, 3-4 years of age, doesn't deserve such wealth from their deceased parents. The ahkam, the Quran steps forward and explains that they have a right to this wealth just like anybody else, just like an adult. The children should not be void of the wealth of their deceased parents. Now, question arises, who is responsible for looking after the orphans? There are 3 individuals or classes of individuals who are responsible for looking after the orphans. Number 1, the dying parents themselves. If the father knows or the mother knows that they are about to leave this world, then they have a responsibility to look after the orphans, to leave behind wealth for their children. According to this verse, Allama Tabrasi in his Majma' al-Bayan explains a situation that used to exist very commonly at the time of Jahiliyyah. When a parent was about to leave this world, notably the father most of the time, the father, as he is about to leave this world, in his final moments, the family would gather around, the friends would gather around, and they would discourage him to leave behind wealth for their children. They would say, look, your children are young, they don't know much. If you were to leave your wealth behind for them, they would squander it. They would use it not in its rightful place. Give away your wealth, give it to us, give it to other. Sallu ala Muhammad. Give it to your friends, give it to other members of your families, give it to your tribesmen, but do not give them to your children. And we have this mentality sometimes, don't we? When the child comes of age, we feel hesitant to give them the wealth that they own. So, this ayah came forward and began to discourage, in fact, disparages the Muslim to behave in such a way. This behavior is not is not in par with the message of Islam. That the father has the right to leave behind inheritance for their children. In fact, it goes on beyond this. If the wealth that has been accumulated by the father is khair, I use this word very, very specifically because the Quran uses this word. If the wealth left behind by the father is khair, meaning that it has been accumulated through halal sources, then this wealth left behind for the children is khair for them as well. And there is only one verse in the Quran that describes wealth as khair. Otherwise, wealth is seen as something that pushes the human being away from Allah. If it is through halal sources, it is khair not only for the person dying, but it is good for their children as well. So, very emotional language is being used here as well. Do not leave your children, your orphans, needy and helpless. Give them something that they can use when they grow up, when they come of age. Give them the wealth that you have accumulated in your life that can help them in their lives as well. Do not leave them needless, do not leave them helpless. The second responsibility is to the wali. The wali also has a responsibility. Maybe it's the uncle, maybe it's certain charities that look after the orphans. The first responsibility of the wali, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا مَالَ الْيَتِيمِ إِلَّا بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. And do not approach the wealth of the yatim, except if you want to add on to it. But do not use it, do not squander it, do not usurp it. You have no right to touch the wealth of the yatim حَتَّى يَبْلُغَ أَشُدَّهُ. Until they become baligh, then it's your responsibility to transfer that wealth to them. In a separate verse, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الْأَمْوَالَ الْيَتَامَ. And the one who squanders or usurps or eats from the wealth of the yatam, from the orphans, إِنَّمَا يَأْكُلُونَ فِي بُطُونِهِمْ نَارًا. It's as if the fires emanate from their bellies. It's as if they are consuming fires straight into their bellies. This is a spiritual sin. The act itself is physical, but the consequences is of a spiritual nature. So the wali has a responsibility. They should not plunder. They should not, for example, squander the wealth of the orphans. They are trustees, and they should be just with the wealth of the orphans. They are to remind themselves, again, very emotionally. The verse is very emotional. All of these different responsible individuals have to behave emotionally as well. They have to behave empathetically. The wali has to behave, or he has to remind himself constantly, how would I feel if someone was to exploit and squander and usurp the rights of my orphans? That is the responsibility that I have with the orphans around me. And it is of course important to bear in mind, and this is the Sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that in social circles, social issues always go around in circles. There's a famous proverb, isn't there, in English? What goes around comes around. This is part of the religion of Islam. Allah has created the system in such a way. If I was to behave with you in a very ill way, bad behavior, bad akhlaq, if I was to usurp your right, I would benefit from it immediately. I would elevate my wealth and my status in the community. But later on, the effects will come back to me. The effects will come back to me, whether it be directly in my life or indirectly in the lives of my descendants. If I was to mistreat an orphan and the rights of the orphans, then that will come back to me. May not necessarily come back to me directly in my life, but definitely in the lives of my descendants. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. In this regards, he says, whosoever looks after the orphan and cares for the orphans, then their children will be cared for. And thirdly, finally, the third responsible for the orphan, or the third demographics within society who are responsible for the orphans, are like people like you and I. People who are not directly involved in the lives of the orphans. Sometimes you'll come across parents who they don't have the wealth to leave behind for their young children. Or sometimes the wealth of the children is taken away from them. We take on that responsibility to provide wealth for the children. And this is exactly what Khadija salamullahi alayha would do. She would come publicly, she would turn to the widows of Mecca, and she would say, if you do not have enough money to look after your children, then come, my doors are always open. She would sponsor hundreds of orphans from her wealth, and we know that she was a very successful businesswoman. She was a philanthropy, yes? She would look after the needy and the downtrodden of her community. This was the legacy of Khadija salamullahi alayha. She would sponsor the orphans of her time, and we ought to utilize this within our lives as well. There are many charities who provide services where we can sponsor certain orphans, as many as we would like, depending on our financial needs and status, for example, to sponsor them, to look after their well-being, to look after their education, medical treatments if necessary. All of this is something that we should all look into, inshaAllah. Taking on or integrating the legacy of Khadija within our lives, inshaAllah. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wal asr. Innal insana lafi khusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat. Wa tawasaw bil haqq. Wa tawasaw bis sabr. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي لا مضاد له في ملكه ولا منازع له في أمره الحمد لله الذي لا شريك له في خلقه ولا شبيه له في عظمته نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد جاء من عنده مصدقا للمرسلين خلف فينا راية الحق عليا وأولاده المعصومين هجج الله اللهم صل على محمد أوصيكم عباد الله وإياي بتقوى الله. Respected brothers and elders, it's important for us to revisit the ahkam of Sawm. And of course, we have been looking at certain ahkams for the past couple of weeks. Today I want to speak about the role of the Musafir, the role of the traveler. When a person travels during the month of Ramadan, he does not have the right to fast. In fact, if he chooses to fast during the month of Ramadan, he says to himself, look, in the olden times, during the time of Rasulullah, people used to travel and it would take them days to travel. And so because of that difficulty, Allah gave them the leniency to not fast. But today, fasting is very easy for us. Traveling is very easy for us. In our cars, the plane, for example, it's much more easier than what it was. And it's easier for us to fast as well in the state of traveling. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala categorically makes it clear that if you are traveling from your city, you have no right to fast. If you go ahead and you fast, it is considered to be a sin. Why a sin? Because you're associating something to the Sharia which is not. Allah has determined fasting to be cancelled for the one who is considered to be a traveler. So the question arises, can I travel during the month of Ramadan? Absolutely. That right is yours. If you need to travel, for example, for business to a different city, you can do so. If you want to travel for a holiday, you don't get holidays throughout the year except that which falls during the month of Ramadan, you can go for a holiday. It's makruh. At times, traveling during the month of Ramadan becomes makruh. One of them is when you don't feel like fasting, but you travel to a different city to break your fast. It's allowed, but it's makruh. It's detestable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it is not considered to be haram. Certain communities during the month of Ramadan, very interestingly, they choose to go for ziyarah towards Iraq, towards Iran, for example, to visit the holy shrines in Najaf, in Karbala. And then all of a sudden you found in one particular scenario that I can remember, the people in the community began to raise questions. And how can they go for ziyarah during the month of Ramadan? Because here we have two choices. Either we stay in the city and we fast, which is wajib, or we go for ziyarah, which is mustahab. So our priorities should always focus on that which is wajib and not that which is mustahab. When the marja was asked this question, that look, the people back home are raising this issue, the marja, he replies, he says, I do not know which one holds more merit. For a person to remain in their city and fast as it has been prescribed in the Holy Quran, or for a person to come towards the shrines of Amir al-Mu'mineen, the shrines of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, during the month of Ramadan, when the deeds and the rewards are exemplified, they're compounded, more so than outside the month of Ramadan. The marja himself says, in the eyes of Allah, I don't know which one is heavier. So when it comes to the idea of traveling in the month of Ramadan, it's very much allowed. And it's not considered to be haram at all. Amongst the fuqaha, they explain that when a person does travel, for example, to a different location, he is not meant to fast, he is not to fast. But as it is based on precaution, it is mustahab for him to refrain from food and drink during the day to uphold the sanctity of the month of Ramadan. I may travel to Dubai, for example, for let's say 5 days. Doesn't mean that I can eat and drink. I have that choice. I can eat and drink as much as I want. But to uphold the sanctity of the month of Ramadan, I should perform imsak based on ihtiyat mustahab. There are 4 scenarios in which a person should fast when he does travel. The first scenario is when the person travels to a different location for more than 10 days, then he ought to fast. The second scenario is when the person is considered to be a frequent traveler. So he travels to different locations constantly, here and there. If he's known as a frequent traveler, as examined by the fuqaha, then he is to fast. The third is when a person has 2 watans and he travels back and forth quite regularly between them. Or even if it's not regular, irregular, between one watan and the other. Both are considered his home, and wherever he may be, he could be in, for example, Dar es Salaam, he could be in London. If both of these places are considered to be his watan, he can travel and he has to fast. And finally, when a person travels for a sinful purpose. There are certain locations in the world which are known for certain actions. And if a person with the intention of performing that particular sin travels to that country, then it is a sinful travel and he has to fast during the month of Ramadan. And of course, there are different laws pertaining to the laws of traveling. If a person leaves before dhuhr, this is a very important mas'ala. When a person leaves before dhuhr, then fasting for that day is nullified, is made invalid. When can he break his fast? He can break his fast after he passes Hadd al-Tarakhus. Hadd al-Tarakhus is 22 kilometers, approximately 22 kilometers from the boundary of the city. So let's say, for example, if I'm fasting, I'm traveling today, I have the intentions of traveling today, I wake up, do I have the right to eat and drink? No. I can only eat and drink, I can only start to eat and drink once I've passed Hadd al-Tarakhus, 22 kilometers from the boundary of the city. Now there's a very important question that arises. The question is, when does my travel begin? Does it begin the moment I leave my home, or does it begin from the moment I leave the city boundary? A few years ago, there was an issue in this community. During the month of Ramadan, certain mu'mineens gathered, and they were to go to London to take part in the Al-Quds March. So they came to the center and they were waiting. They were meant to leave before Dhuhr, but the coaches came late, until one of them said, oh, hold on a second, if the coaches come very late and we leave after Dhuhr, then we will have to fast. And you could see the panic in their faces when they were asked to, or when they thought of fasting for that day. The fuqaha mentioned the travel begins when you leave your home, not when you leave the boundaries of the city. The moment you leave your home, you have no intention to come back. You have now begun your safar. So whether you're in the city, as long as you do not return home, you are still considered to be a traveler, even if you're still in the city after the time of Dhuhr. I'll give you another example. Say, for example, you live in London. You live in London or Birmingham or wherever. You're traveling, you go to the airport. You've checked in, you've signed in, your luggages are checked in, everything is done. All of this takes place before Dhuhr. You're now waiting to board onto the plane. You board onto the plane takes off half an hour after Dhuhr. Does that mean that you have to carry on fasting because your plane took off half an hour after Dhuhr? No. You're considered to be a traveler the moment you left your home. So that's a very important discussion to bear in mind. Last week we spoke about eating and drinking. This is a second bracket or a second field within the ahkam of Sawm. Very quickly, we have a few minutes. Last week we spoke about eating and drinking and the different laws associated with it. Vomiting, we know that it breaks the fast. It only breaks the fast when it is done intentionally, when it is done deliberately. When I vomit or I make myself vomit, this of course invalidates my fast. But if it happens accidentally, whether it be nausea, whether it be anxiety, whether it be me going through a very stressful situation, public speaking sometimes can trigger vomiting. This is not in my control. This is not deliberate. If I do vomit, it does not invalidate my fast. Vomiting only invalidates the fast if it is done deliberately, purposely. Question arises, if I feel like I'm about to vomit, can I stop myself? Yes, you can stop yourself. Meaning you can take medicine if you know that your health is going to deteriorate. Can I eat something for sahri? This is a very common question as well. Can I eat something for sahri which I know will make me vomit the next day? Ayatollah Sistani, Hafadahullah, says there's no issue in this whatsoever, but it's mustahab to perform qada for it as well. وآخر الدعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد. اللهم صل وسلم على عبدك ورسولك سيد المرسلين ورسول رب العالمين محمد المصطفى. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أمير المؤمنين ووسي رسول رب العالمين علي المرتضى. وعلى سيدة النساء العالمين وبدءة الخاتم النبيين فاطمة الزهراء. اللهم صل على محمد. وعلى سيد الشباب أهل الجنة الحسن المجتبى والحسين سيد الشهداء. اللهم صل على محمد. وعلى علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والحجة بن الحسن قائم المنتظر المهدي. أرواحنا وأرواح العالمين له الفداء. اللهم افتح له فتحا يسيرا وانصره نصرا عزيزا. اللهم إنا نرغب إليك في دولة كريمة تعز بها الإسلام وأهله وتذل بها النفاق وأهله وتجعلنا فيها من الدعاة إلى طاعتك والقادة في سبيلك وترزقنا بها كرامة الدنيا والآخرة. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. وصل اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.